They say the first kings ruled for thousands of years, not decades, not centuries, for thousands. Imagine a man who lives long enough to watch rivers change their course, to see entire forests turn to desert, to witness the rise and fall of stars in the sky. That's what the ancient tablets tell us. Before the flood, they ruled for 1,200 years. It sounds impossible. It should sound impossible. And yet, there it is, etched in cuneiform on clay older than the pyramids, written by hands that trembled beneath the weight of gods. The Sumerian King List, a record of rulers so ancient that history itself shivers in its presence. The voice of civilization's dawn. But whose voice is it really? The voice of myth or memory? The wind over the plains of Mesopotamia whispers through the ruins of Ur and Eridu, through the broken temples and the cracked ziggurats that still claw at the sky. Beneath the dust, beneath the bones, beneath 5,000 years of silence, lies a story that refuses to die. A story that begins long before men wrote history, when kings ruled before the flood. Picture it, a world drenched in twilight, the air heavy with mist from the Euphrates, the ground trembling under storms that never end. The gods walk among men, or so the ancients believed. They teach writing, measure time, divide the heavens. Humanity is young, fragile, half awake. And yet something pushes them to remember, to record. Two aliths, not myths, not fables, but reigns. Numbers, Enmenlu, Anna ruled for 200 years. Enmengal, Anna, 800. Dumusid the shepherd, 36, Zalozand. These aren't fairy tales. They're written like facts, as if someone saw these kings, counted their years, and kept their records for eternity. And that's what haunts historians. Because whoever wrote those lines wasn't writing fiction. The tone of those tablets isn't poetic or grandiose, it's bureaucratic, cold, like an accountant recording taxes. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That's the first line. After the kingship descended from heaven, the words echo like thunder from another world. Was it a metaphor? Or was it something far stranger? Thousands of years later, we dig up those words from the dirt, and we can't look away. Clay that shouldn't have survived the centuries still bears those strange lists from city to city, reign to reign. Archaeologists found them in the early 20th century, deep in the ruins of Nippur, Lhasa, and Sumer itself. Broken fragments, scattered like a code across time. When assembled, they told one continuous story, the story of kings who ruled before the Great Flood. But what flood? Every ancient civilization remembers one. The Bible calls it Noah's flood. The Akkadians told of Atrahasis. The Babylonians spoke of Utnapishtim, the man who built the first ark. The Sumerians had Zusudra, all the same tale in different tongues. And right before that cataclysm, according to the King List, came those impossible reigns. 1,000 years of kingship. Then the flood swept over the world. And when the waters receded, something had changed forever. The lifespan of kings collapsed from tens of thousands of years to hundreds. The gods withdrew. Humanity was on its own. It's almost too cinematic to believe. A civilization so ancient it brushed shoulders with the divine, only to drown beneath its own myth. Yet every line of the King List insists this was history. A lineage of rules stretching beyond imagination, written not in poetry but in record. Why would scribes of ancient Sumer, the inventors of writing itself, inscribe lies onto sacred clay? What compelled them to give precise numbers, names, and cities? What did they see that made them believe this was truth? Close your eyes and listen. The wind against those ruins carries voices, ancient, chanting, rhythmic. You can almost hear them calling the names of forgotten kings. Menlu Anna, Enmengal Anna, Dumuzad. Each name was once a man or perhaps something more. Each one reigned in a city of light and mud-brick temples, where the gods were near and the stars told secrets to the priests at night. when they wrote, "Kingship descended from heaven," maybe they meant exactly that. Something fell from the sky, something divine, and it changed everything. The King List wasn't a single text. It evolved over centuries, copied and rewritten, but always with the same structure. A city receives kingship, a ruler's name, the length of his reign. Then kingship passes elsewhere, as if power itself were a heavenly relic, migrating from city to city. Kingship was in Eridu. Then Eridu fell, and kingship was taken to Bad Tibera, a divine torch handed down through ages. When you look at it that way, the King List isn't just a list. It's a cosmic timeline, a map of the divine right to rule. The Sumerians weren't chronicling politics. They were trying to describe how heaven governed earth. They saw time itself as cyclical, ruled by patterns written in the stars, and perhaps that's why their first kings lived for millennia. To them, divine rule wasn't measured in mortal years, it was measured in eras, in ages, in cycles of the cosmos. Still, the precision is unsettling. 43,200 years. Not many, not countless. 43,200, the kind of number that begs for explanation. Did it mean lunar months, solar years, or something symbolic? Even if we divide those reigns by 60, the Sumerian sacred number, they're still impossibly long. Whatever those numbers meant, the ancients treated them with reverence. To question them was to question the foundation of kingship itself. And yet, when we read it today, with modern eyes and skeptical minds, the King List feels like a whisper from before time began, like someone tried to preserve the memory of a world that wasn't supposed to be remembered. A world where humans and gods shared the same breath. Maybe that's why the text survived. Because even if the details blurred, the feeling never died, the sense that something vast once moved across the earth, leaving only echoes in clay. Under the light of torches, in the ruins of Nipper, archaeologists brushed away sand and found those echoes. Each fragment told a different part of the story, yet together they formed a single pulse. You can almost picture it: a scholar in the 1920s, dirt under his nails, holding a tablet to the light and realizing the scale of what he's found. The words flicker into life, and suddenly he's staring into prehistory itself. Not myths, records. Not gods, kings. The oldest record of human government, the first chronicle of rule. But why record it at all? Maybe the Sumerians feared forgetting. Maybe they wanted to anchor themselves to something eternal. In a world where floods could erase entire cities overnight, to write was to defy oblivion. And so they carved names into clay, pressing their stylus deep as if to pin memory to earth itself. They believed that to speak a name was to make it live again. That's why, even now, when we read En Men Luana, something ancient stirs a spark, a trace of immortality. The King List begins in Eridu, the first city. To the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't just a place, it was paradise, the seat of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and the deep waters. Legend said that kingship first descended there, a heavenly institution brought down to organize the chaos of early humanity. Before kings, there was only wildness. After kings, there was order, writing, law, the birth of civilization itself. And that's what the list really describes, not just who ruled, but the transformation of man into something capable of memory. Imagine Eridu then, the marshes shimmering with early morning mist, reeds swaying beside temples of sun-baked brick. The smell of wet clay and burning incense, priests in animal skins offering libations to gods that watched from the shadows, and at the center, a throne. Upon it, the first king of the first city, In Men Lunae, his reign stretching not years but ages. Did he really live that long? Probably not. But to those who remembered him, he ruled forever. His name outlived the bones of his people. Maybe that's what they meant by 43,000 years, the immortality of memory. But then comes the flood. The tablets say it as simply as a bureaucrat's note, then the flood swept over. No drama, no explanation, just a line that divides the world in two, before and after. Before, gods ruled beside men. After, kings were mortal. Before, time was divine. After, it was human. That single sentence is the hinge of civilization. The Sumerians knew they were living in the aftermath of something cosmic. They built their cities upon the bones of that memory, and maybe that's why the king list matters. Because it's not just a list of rulers, it's humanity's first attempt to make sense of eternity, to chart time itself, to reconcile the divine and the mortal, the eternal and the fleeting. And as you read those ancient lines, you feel it, that pull between myth and truth, between memory and imagination. It's the same pull that drives us still, to dig, to question, to remember. Because maybe, just maybe, the Sumerians weren't lying. Maybe they were trying to tell us something in the only language they had. Something that happened long before written history, something that reshaped the world, something we've almost forgotten. And if they were right, if kingship truly descended from heaven, then the story of humanity isn't just one of evolution, but of inheritance, of something west given to us by the sky itself, something we still carry in our hunger to rule, to create, to remember. The clay may have cracked, the temples may have fallen, but the idea remains. Listen closely. The wind across Sumer still whispers names we can barely pronounce. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larek, Sipa, Shuropak, cities that once glowed like stars before the flood took them. Their kings ruled for ages beyond comprehension, and then were gone. Yet their memory endures, carved in clay, echoing through time like a heartbeat beneath the sands. And if we lean close enough, if we listen with the patience of centuries, we might just hear what they were trying to say. The flood had come and gone. The world that emerged was quieter, smaller, fragile. The skies that once glowed with the fire of gods now hung dim and pale. The rivers withdrew from the plains, leaving scars across the earth like memories carved into flesh, and from those scars life began again. Kingship, the tablets say, descended once more, but this time the kings were not immortal. The age of eternity had ended. The age of man had begun. The first city after the flood was Kish. Then kingship was taken to Kish, the tablet declares, as if heaven itself had passed judgment and chosen its next keeper. Gone were the rulers of 40,000 years. The first king of Kish, Jusha, ruled for 1,200 years. Still vast, but already fading. By the time of the third dynasty, reigns lasted decades. Mortal years. The divine had retreated, leaving mankind with memory and the unbearable weight of its absence. Picture Kish rising from the mud, its temples rebuilt from the bones of drowned cities. The survivors look to the sky, praying that the gods have not abandoned them. And when they crown their new kings, they do so trembling, because they know what the king list makes clear: every kingdom ends. Every city falls. Kingship moves on, as if carried by a wind no mortal can control. Eridu, Bad, Tibera, Larek, Sipar, Shuropak, all gone. Now Kish stands alone, a flickering torch in the ruins of prehistory. The Sumerians didn't see time as we do. To them, history wasn't a straight line but a great wheel, turning, grinding, repeating. The king list is proof of that. Power rises, it reigns, it collapses, and then it begins again elsewhere. It's not a story of progress, it's a ritual, a pattern as old as the stars, and maybe that's why they listed reigns in such impossible spans. Because to the Sumerians, these weren't merely rulers, they were ages incarnate, cosmic eras given human names. When En, Men, Lu, Anna ruled, the stars themselves obeyed. When Dumusid the shepherd reigned, the earth was still half divine, but now the torch burns lower. Kish gives way to Uruk. The list continues, relentless, clinical. In Uruk, Emerka became king. He ruled for 420 years. Lugalbanda, The shepherd ruled for 200. The gods are still there, but distant, their voices growing faint. The people begin to build walls, high, thick, unyielding. For the first time, man fortifies himself not against beasts, but against each other. The age of heroes fades into the age of kings. The clay tablets shift from myth to memory, from eternity to record. History has begun, and yet the list never breaks the rhythm. It flows like a river, city to city, king to king. Uruk to to Awan to Hamazi, Hamazi to Mari. Each reign passes like a shadow across the desert. Some kings are given lifetimes, others mere names. It's as though the scribes were tracing the heartbeat of civilization itself, pulsing, fading, then rising again. We read their words now and feel the distance between them and us shrink. They wrote about the same things we fear: time, loss, the silence after greatness. They watched their cities crumble and tried to make sense of why. Maybe that's what the King List really was. A map of divine absence. A record of what happens when the gods stop watching. But there's something else. Something hidden in the way the Sumerians spoke of kingship, descending from heaven. That phrase wasn't a metaphor to them. It was literal. They believed kingship was a thing, a sacred power that came down from the sky. When a city fell, that power lifted, vanished into the heavens, and then descended upon another place. To hold kingship was to be chosen. To lose it was to be forgotten. The King List was their way of remembering those who once bore the weight of heaven. And in that sense, it's more than a chronicle. It's scripture. The first theology of rule. Every later empire, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, would echo it. The idea that the right to rule comes from the gods was born in these lines. And perhaps that's why the Sumerians preserved them so carefully, even when their language died, even when their cities turned to dust. To forget the list was to forget who we were. Imagine the scribes of centuries after the flood, sitting by lamplight, pressing each sign into wet clay. The sound of the stylus tapping, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. They knew the names they wrote were ancient beyond comprehension. They didn't question them. They preserved them, because to record was to honor. To remember was to resist death itself. By the time of Gilgamesh, the fifth king of Uruk, the world had changed completely. The flood was legend now, but the fear of it still haunted every whisper of thunder. Gilgamesh, the semi-divine warrior who sought immortality, appears in the King List too. He ruled for 126 years, not thousands, but still beyond human measure. The gods were nearly gone, yet their shadow still touched the blood of kings. In the epic of Gilgamesh, the great hero travels to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, the last man granted eternal life. It's as if the story itself was born from the gap between the pre-flood kings and the mortal rulers who came after. Gilgamesh is humanity's lament for the lost age of eternity. He searches for what the King List hints at. The secret of those who reigned before death came into the world. And when he fails, he returns to Uruk, to his city, to build walls, to make something that will outlive him. Because even if the gods are gone, the memory of their age must endure. That's the tragedy of the King List. It begins with immortality and ends with mortality. It's the story of humanity losing its divine fire, one line at a time, from 200 years to 126 to 36 to 12, each reign shorter than the last, each king more human than the one before. You can almost feel the slow extinguishing of the divine spark, but still the list continues. Lagash, Adab, Mari, Kish again, dynasties rise and fall, swallowed by time. Yet the scribes never stopped updating it. Even as empires burned, they kept writing, kept adding names, because deep down, they must have believed the pattern would repeat. That kingship would descend again. That maybe, one day, the gods would return. When archaeologists uncovered the tablets, they noticed something strange. Each copy was slightly different. Some names missing, others added. Some reigns shorter, others longer. It's as if every generation was trying to piece together a truth already fading beyond recall. Each city rewriting the list to prove its own divine right, every scribe grasping at the last echo of heaven. And yet, despite the differences, the structure never changed. The same rhythm, the same order, the same sacred phrase, after the kingship descended from heaven. It's that refrain, that haunting repetition, that turns the king list from a record into a ritual chant. You can almost imagine it spoken aloud in temples, each name recited like a prayer. En men galana, du musid en sepad zena. 14 kings of Eridu, then the flood, then Kish, then Uruk, then A rhythm older than writing, a pulse older than civilization itself. When you read it aloud, you feel something primal awaken. It's not logic that speaks, it's memory, the kind of memory buried deep in the bones of humanity. We all come from somewhere older than history, older than words. The king list is that whisper, the sound of the first civilizations trying to remember the dawn. And that's what makes it terrifying, because buried within those names is the suggestion that we've forgotten something enormous, something that once defined who we were, something that was taken from us in the flood. The Sumerians didn't see the deluge as punishment. They saw it as a reset, the gods cleansing the world of chaos only to start again. What if the king list was their attempt to preserve what came before that cleansing? What if they succeeded? Every civilization since has carried that same unease, the sense that there was once a golden age, an age when man and the divine were one. The Greeks called it the age of Kronos. The Hindus call it the Satya Yuga. The Egyptians spoke of Zeptepi, the first time, and the Sumerians. They wrote it in clay. They named the kings who ruled in that forgotten world. 240, 1,200 years of reigns, and then silence. It's tempting to dismiss it as myth. But myths persist for a reason. They carry something that logic alone cannot kill. Maybe those impossible numbers weren't meant to be read as years, but as symbols. Cycles of time, cosmic patterns. Or maybe, just maybe, they meant exactly what they wrote. Maybe there was an age before the flood when something beyond human ruled the earth. And if that's true, then the king list isn't just history, it's a warning. Because every line ends the same way. Kingship moves on. Eridu fell, Kish fell, Uruk fell. No city, no ruler, no age lasts forever. The torch of power always moves, and it leaves ashes behind. Even gods, it seems, have their time. When you stand among the ruins of Sumer, when the wind brushes across the cracked stones of Ur or Eridu, you can feel that cycle still turning. The same wind that once carried incense and prayers now carries only dust. Yet beneath that dust lies the oldest dream, the dream of kingship, of order descending from the heavens, of man trying to remember what he once was. And maybe that's why the king list still haunts us. Because in the end, it's not about Sumer at all. It's about us. The need to record, to remember, to find meaning in the passing of time. The desperate hope that our names, too, might be carved somewhere that time can't erase. The Sumerians pressed their memories into clay. We press ours into silicon and light, but the impulse is the same, the refusal to vanish. And so, the king list endures, a heartbeat from the dawn of civilization, echoing through every age that followed. It reminds us that history didn't begin with certainty. It began with awe, with fear, with the impossible, with the belief that something greater once walked beside us. And as the last king of Uruk fades into dust, as the ink of memory dries upon the tablets, the question remains, who were those kings who ruled before the flood? And what did they leave behind, buried beneath the sands of time, waiting to be found once more? The desert never forgets. Beneath its silence lie the bones of worlds long gone, the echoes of kings who once called themselves divine. Thousands of years after the last Sumerian scribe pressed his stylus into clay, the sands began to give them back, one fragment at a time. It was the early 20th century when archaeologists brushed away the dust from those tablets in Nippur and Lhasa, their hands trembling as they read the impossible, kings who ruled before the flood. Numbers that mocked the limits of human life. And as the sun burned low over the plains of Iraq, history itself seemed to flicker. Because what they were holding didn't belong to any history they knew. It belonged to something older, something we weren't meant to remember. The Sumerian King List, written in the same script that once gave us trade accounts and temple records, wasn't a myth. It was an official document, carved with precision, copied by generations of scribes, and preserved as sacred truth. That's what unsettled the scholars. Myths they could handle. Myths had symbolism, poetry, meaning. But this was arithmetic. It had the cold precision of a ledger, as if someone long ago had actually counted those reigns, as if they believed, or knew, they were true. And yet, what if those numbers weren't years at all? What if they were something else? A code, a measure of time we no longer understand. Some have suggested lunar cycles or ancient calendars lost to the flood. But even when you translate them, even when you divide and reason, the result remains impossible. The magnitude of time still stretches far beyond any mortal rule. The King List refuses to shrink into reason. It stands defiant, as if to say you have forgotten what time really means. Think of it this way. To the Sumerians, the gods themselves were not immortal in the human sense. They were cyclical. They rose and fell with the heavens, their power ebbing and flowing like the stars. The King List may have been their attempt to map that divine rhythm, to place kings within the great machinery of cosmic time. The reigns of tens of thousands of years weren't lifetimes. They were eras, the breath of creation expanding and contracting. And when the flood came, that breath stopped. Then began again, smaller, shallower human. But there are other interpretations, ones that linger in the shadows of archaeology, whispered by those who stare too long into the abyss of the ancient world. What if the Sumerians weren't speaking metaphorically at all? What if they were describing beings who really lived that long, the gods who ruled before the flood, not as deities of faith, but as rulers of flesh and blood, visitors, teachers, beings who brought kingship down from heaven and then left, their reign washed away by the flood they knew was coming. It's a dangerous thought, but it refuses to die. Erich von Däniken called them ancient astronauts. Others call them the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumer, those who descended from the heavens to shape mankind. To the priests of Eridu, Enki was not a myth but a presence, a being of light and wisdom who taught them to build, to write, to rule. In the oldest hymns, they call him Lord of the Deep, a master of knowledge who raised the kingship from the waters. And the King List, perhaps, was their attempt to trace his lineage, to record the reigns of those who carried his light. You don't have to believe in aliens or lost gods to feel the pull of that idea. There's something instinctive about it, something buried deep in the human soul, the sense that once we walk beside beings greater than ourselves. That knowledge, civilization, even consciousness came not from within, but from above. Every ancient culture tells the same story in different words. The Egyptians had Osiris, the Greeks had Prometheus, the Maya had Kukulkan, bringers of wisdom, punished or vanished for giving fire to man. The Sumerians called theirs the Anunnaki, and they ruled before the flood. When you read the King List in that light, it feels less like a chronicle and more like a confession. A memory encoded in the only way the ancients knew, through the language of kingship. They couldn't say, beings from the sky taught us. So they said, kingship descended from heaven. The meaning is the same, only wrapped in reverence. And then the flood, the line drawn through eternity. Whether you believe it was divine punishment, natural disaster, or mythic allegory, every culture remembers it. But in the King List, it's more than catastrophe. It's transition. The divine rule ends, and human rule begins. The world changes shape, and the memory of that divine age is sealed in clay. Millennia later, we find those tablets and struggle to comprehend them. Because the Sumerians weren't trying to entertain us, they were trying to preserve something that terrified them. The knowledge that time had broken once, that the world before the flood was not like ours, and that the gods who ruled it had vanished. Maybe they feared they would vanish too. Maybe they hoped that by writing their names, by immortalizing the line of kings, they could hold on to some fragment of eternity. Think about what that means. The first written record in human history is not about war or love or law. It's about remembering rulers who reigned before the flood. The very first thing we chose to write was a memory of lost gods. That's not coincidence. That's instinct. The moment we learned to write, we used it to preserve the thing we were most afraid to forget. When you walk through the ruins of Ur or Eridu today, the silence feels heavy. The ziggurats are gone, their bricks melted back into the earth, but the air still hums with the residue of that age. The people who lived here were the first to build cities, the first to measure time, the first to dream of eternity, and they left behind a list, a record that still whispers we were not alone. Modern historians dismiss it, of course. They say the numbers were symbolic, the names part of political propaganda. And maybe they're right, but even they admit no other civilization on Earth recorded its own prehistory with such mathematical precision. The King List isn't like myth, it's like science, obsessed with order, with chronology, with continuity. It was meant to prove that kingship, civilization itself, was unbroken from the dawn of creation, that every ruler, no matter how mortal, carried a trace of the divine. Maybe that's why it endures, because it's not just about who ruled. It's about the idea of rule itself, the need for order, for meaning, for lineage. Every empire since has followed that same template. Pharaohs, Caesars, emperors, all claiming descent from gods, from stars, from heaven. It started here on the clay of Sumer when the first human looked at the chaos of the world and said, "I am chosen, I am king." And yet, beneath that pride, there's sorrow. The King List is a dirge as much as a record, the sound of humanity mourning the loss of the divine. Then the flood swept over, 6 words that ended eternity, 6 words that made us human. Somewhere in a museum, those tablets still rest. Their symbols cracked but legible, their words older than the Bible, older than Egypt. When you stand before them, you can feel time collapse. You are staring at the moment memory became history, at the first heartbeat of civilization. And behind that heartbeat, the echo of something else, something vast, something that once ruled the earth. The Sumerians believed that to speak a name was to give it life. So even now, when we read their list, we bring their kings back into the world. Enmenluana, Dumuzid, in Sipad, Zid, and Gilgamesh. Each syllable is a resurrection, each name a defiance of oblivion. And maybe that's what they wanted all along, not for us to believe, but to remember, to carry the torch of kingship through the ages, to keep asking what came before the flood, because maybe that's the secret, that the King List isn't a message from the past, but a mirror, a reflection of our own hunger to understand where we came from, to believe that our story began with something more than chance, that we are heirs to a legacy we can no longer name. And so the question lingers, whispered in the wind that moves over the ruins of Sumer, carried by the same dust that once filled the lungs of kings. What if they were right? What if kingship really did descend from heaven? What if those numbers, those reigns of impossible length, are not exaggerations, but evidence? What if the line between myth and history isn't a line at all, but a shadow, shifting, ancient, and alive? Maybe that's why the tablets survived when so much else did not. Because some truths are too heavy to die. The flood washed the world clean, but memory clung to the clay, and in that clay the story endures. The gods are gone. The cities are ruins. The kings are dust. But their names still echo, across deserts, across time, across the silence of history itself. Listen closely. The King List still speaks. It tells us that everything we build will one day fall, that every crown will turn to ash, and that every age will end in water. But it also tells us something else, that memory is stronger than death, that somewhere in the darkness before the flood, humanity first learned to write, and the first thing we wrote was our longing for eternity. If the echoes of the ancient world still haunt your imagination, if the whispers of the Sumerian kings still send a chill through your spine, then you've just begun to glimpse the depth of our forgotten past. The truth is buried, not lost, not gone, waiting for those who dare to question, to dig, to wonder. Because history isn't just written in stone, it's carved into our very DNA. So if you crave more of these hidden chronicles, these unsolved riddles of our ancient world, join us on this journey through time. Subscribe to Unsolved History, where the past never dies, it only waits to be rediscovered.